In the early years of the 19th century, the Spanish royal treasury held the most expensive secret in the world. It was stone-cold empty. While the sun technically never set on the Spanish Empire, stretching from the frozen peaks of the Andes to the bustling plazas of Mexico City, the crown was a hollow giant, sustained by the memory of gold rather than the reality of it. The very silver that had once fueled the global economy and built the cathedrals of Madrid had become a noose. The more wealth the colonies produced, the more Spain grew addicted to a treasure it could no longer protect, and the more the people born in the New World realized they were paying for a motherland that didn't even know their names. There was a quiet understanding among the merchants in Caracas and the scholars in Buenos Aires that the order of the world was a fragile illusion maintained by ink and distance. They spoke of a grand reform, a dream that Spain might finally treat its American territories as partners rather than ATMs, but the truth was already hardening in the shadows of the royal court. The mistake wasn't a single battle or a lost fleet. It was the arrogant belief that loyalty could be commanded through stagnation while the rest of the world was catching fire. The year 1808 arrived like a thunderclap that shattered the spine of the monarchy. Napoleon Bonaparte, under the guise of an alliance, marched his legions across the Pyrenees and forced the Spanish king into a humiliating abdication. Suddenly, the head of the empire was severed. In the plazas of the New World, the news arrived months late like a ghost story. If there was no king in Madrid, who held the keys to the Americas? The vacuum of power did not remain empty for long. While Spanish patriots fought a desperate guerrilla war against French bayonets at home, the colonial elites, the criollos, tasted a terrifying, intoxicating possibility. For the first time in 3 centuries, they were breathing air that didn't smell of old Spanish parchment. Tensions that had simmered for generations began to boil over. The crown attempted to tighten its grip from afar, demanding more taxes and more devotion, even as it failed to provide defense or trade. In the heart of New Spain, a parish priest named Miguel Hidalgo rang a church bell that echoed across a continent, turning a grievance into a bloody, chaotic crusade. It wasn't just a riot, it was the birth of a realization that the Atlantic Ocean was no longer a bridge, but a divorce. The Spanish authorities responded not with diplomacy, but with the iron fist of the old guard, unaware that every execution and every crushed rebellion was merely tempering the steel of a new, revolutionary identity. By the time the Spanish monarchy was restored, the damage was irreversible. The returning king, Ferdinand VII, looked upon his rebellious colonies not with a desire to heal, but with a thirst for vengeance. He rejected the liberal constitutions that might have saved the empire, choosing instead to send over 10,000 veteran troops across the sea to pacify a land that had already learned to govern itself. This was the moment of no return. The war shifted from a series of local uprisings into a continental struggle for existence. In the south, José de San Martín was beginning his impossible march across the sky-high passes of the Andes, while in the north, Simón Bolívar, the liberator, was emerging from the sweltering jungles of the Orinoco, driven by a vision of a unified, independent America that would haunt the Spanish crown until its dying breath. The Andes became a graveyard for the Old World's ambitions. As San Martin's army emerged from the freezing mists of the mountain passes, the Spanish royalists realized they were no longer fighting mere rebels, but a disciplined force fueled by the singular, terrifying idea of home. In the north, Bolívar's war to the death stripped away the last veneers of colonial civility, turning the vast plains and dense jungles into a theater of unrelenting attrition. The Spanish officers, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars who had once stood against the greatest conqueror in Europe, now found themselves paralyzed by a geography they could not master and a population that saw them as foreign occupiers. Madrid, paralyzed by its own internal coups and a treasury that was little more than a ledger of debts, could offer no salvation. The final desperate gamble came in 1820 when a massive expeditionary force gathered in Cadiz to reclaim the Americas. But the soldiers, sensing the futility of dying for a bankrupt crown in a land they had never seen, mutinied before they even boarded the ships. This betrayal at the water's edge was the final heartbeat of the empire's power. Without reinforcements, the viceroys in Lima and Mexico City were left as islands of royalism in a rising sea of republicanism. By 1824, the drama converged on the high plains of Ayacucho. Under a pale Andean sun, the remnants of the Spanish imperial army, a patchwork of weary regulars and local loyalists, faced the united liberating forces of Antonio José de Sucre. It was a battle fought in the thin air of the peaks, where every breath was a struggle, and every charge felt like the final gasp of 3 centuries of history. The charge of the Patriot cavalry shattered the Spanish lines, and with the capture of the Viceroy, the administrative spine of the Spanish Americas was finally snapped. The banners of the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, which had flown over the New World since the days of Columbus and Cortez, were lowered in one city after another. The maps of the world were being redrawn in ink that was still wet with the blood of a generation. Spain, once the arbiter of global fate, was forced to look across the Atlantic at a horizon that no longer belonged to her. The great empire had been reduced to an exhausted peninsula, while the continent it had birthed began the chaotic, violent, and glorious task of inventing itself. The final act did not conclude with a grand treaty or a celebratory parade, but with a haunting, quiet realization in the halls of the Escorial. King Ferdinand VII, stubborn to the last, refused to sign the papers that would acknowledge the sovereignty of his former subjects, clinging to the titles of King of the Spains and the Indies as if the words themselves could command the tides. But the reality was written in the empty harbors of Cadiz and the silent counting-houses of Seville. The silver fleets were gone. The monopoly was broken. Spain, the pioneer of the global age, had become a ghost in its own house, watching from the cliffs of Europe as its children built a world that no longer spoke to its father. The empire's legacy was a jagged landscape of young, fragile republics, born in the fire of Bolívar's dreams and the cold steel of San Martin's resolve. In the streets of Mexico City and Lima, the statues of conquistadores were cast in a new, uncertain light, no longer symbols of an eternal order, but monuments to a closed chapter. Spain had traded an entire continent for the pride of a crumbling throne, leaving behind a language, a religion, and a profound, lingering trauma of displacement. The New World was no longer a possession, it was a mirror, reflecting back to Madrid the image of a power that had forgotten how to evolve. As the last Spanish garrisons boarded ships for the long, somber voyage back across the Atlantic, they looked back at the receding coastline of South America, a land of emerald jungles and silver-veined mountains that had once been the envy of kings. The empire on which the sun never set had finally watched the horizon darken. The tragedy was not that the empire fell, for all empires are destined to dust, but that it had held on so tightly that it broke the very thing it claimed to love. The story of Spain in the Americas ended not with a bang, but with the steady, rhythmic sound of waves against a hull, carrying the remnants of a golden age back to a shore that was now just another corner of a rapidly changing world. The final silence of the empire was not found on the battlefield, but in the stroke of a pen that many in Madrid still refuse to hold. By 1826, the last Spanish stronghold at the fortress of Real Felipe in Callao surrendered, its starving defenders emerging into a sunlight that no longer belonged to the king. The once mighty Spanish navy, which had carved the path for global trade, was reduced to a collection of rotting hulls, unable to project even a shadow of its former terror across the Atlantic. The silver of Potosi and the gold of Mexico now flowed toward London and Paris, fueling an industrial revolution that Spain had missed while clinging to the divine right of kings. Back in Spain, the homecoming of the defeated Ayacuchos, the officers who had lost the Americas, brought a bitter infection of instability to the mainland. The soldiers who had failed to save an empire now turned their frustrations inward, sparking decades of civil strife and ideological fracturing that would haunt the Iberian Peninsula for a century. The New World was no longer a treasury, it was a ghost that sat at the Spanish table, a reminder of a grandeur that had been traded for stagnant pride.
The crown had prioritized the purity of its control over the prosperity of its people, and in doing so, it had inherited a kingdom of silence.
In the newly born republics of the Americas, the bells of independence rang with a frantic, uncertain joy. The transition from subjects to citizens was not a clean break but a violent birth, as the shadow of 300 years of colonial hierarchy loomed over the young nations. The maps were drawn, the flags were raised, and the Spanish language, the one bridge that remained, now carried the decrees of presidents instead of the commands of viceroys. The ocean, which had once been a tether, was now a wall, and the sun that had famously never set on the Spanish Empire finally dipped below the horizon of the Western world. The final epitaph of the Spanish Empire was written not in blood, but in the crushing weight of silence that settled over the ports of Andalusia. As the last shattered remnants of the colonial bureaucracy returned to a motherland they barely recognized, they brought with them a hollow truth. Spain had spent 3 centuries building a world only to find it had no place left within it. The silver of the Potosi mines, which had once bankrolled the wars of Europe and the cathedrals of the soul, was gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a second-tier power clinging to the scraps of its own memory. In the end, the tragedy of the empire that lost the New World was its inability to imagine a future where it was not the master. By the time the crown realized that an empire is held together by the consent of the governed rather than the edge of a sword, the bond had already turned to ash. The vast, vibrant tapestry of the Americas, from the heights of the Andes to the halls of Mexico, was no longer an extension of Spain, but a kaleidoscope of new identities, each carving its own path into a modern age that the Spanish monarchy had tried so desperately to forestall. The sun did eventually set. It set on the galleons, on the viceroys, and on the dream of a universal Catholic monarchy. As the maps were finalized and the new republics began the long, agonizing process of self-invention, Spain was left to contemplate the ruins of its own ambition. It stood as a ghost at the feast of the 19th century, a cautionary tale of how the greatest power on earth can be undone not by a single enemy, but by the slow, suffocating rot of its own refusal to change. The New World was lost, but in its place, a dozen nations were born, carrying the language of the fallen giant into a future where the name of the king was nothing more than a footnote in the history of liberty.